the push for market liberalization.
In this segment, we will explore South Korea's agricultural market liberalization, focusing on the Uruguay round negotiations, the introduction of tariffication, and their impact on the country's rice market. We will discuss the effects of trade liberalization on staple crops, the tensions between domestic food security and global trade commitments, and farmers' resistance to these changes. Aside from issues related to rice varieties, Korea's rice farming sector has faced another serious challenge. Since the late 1970s, the trend of opening up to agricultural imports has been intensifying, as we saw in the previous lectures. Even urban consumers who are not engaged in agriculture became aware of Korea's full-scale push to open agricultural markets during the debates surrounding the Uruguay round in the early 1990s. The Uruguay round negotiations, which took place between 1986 and 1994, culminated in the agreement on agriculture, compelling countries to reduce trade barriers and open their domestic markets to international competition. As a country that had long relied on agricultural protectionism to support its farmers, South Korea found itself under significant pressure to conform to these newly established global trade norms. Before the Uruguay round, South Korea had implemented stringent import restrictions on essential staple crops, particularly rice, to shield domestic farmers from foreign competition. However, as globalization accelerated and market liberalization emerged as a dominant force in international trade, South Korea had to carefully negotiate the extent to which it could expose its agricultural sector to foreign imports.
The tariffication of the rice market.
As a result of the Uruguay round agreements, South Korea was able to secure a temporary delay in fully liberalizing its rice market through the Minimum Market Access or MMA agreement. Under this arrangement, the country committed to importing a controlled quantity of foreign rice each year while retaining its domestic price support system for locally grown rice. This compromise allowed South Korea to maintain a degree of agricultural protectionism while gradually introducing elements of trade liberalization. The South Korean government wanted to avoid the criticism that opening the rice market would drive farmers and rural areas, widely regarded as the backbone of Korea, into crisis. Therefore, rice imported through the Minimum Market Access Agreement was not released for direct consumption, but was instead used as an ingredient in snacks, bread, ramen, and sold as an ingredient for brewing. One of the unforeseen consequences of this policy was that Korea's traditional opaque rice wine, makgeolli, became reliant on imported rice. Korean makgeolli had already experienced a transition to wheat flour in the 1960s and 1970s when the use of rice in brewing was banned. Brewers who had become accustomed to using low-cost grains for brewing immediately switched to the much cheaper imported rice when it became available, and consumers welcomed the stable price of makgeolli. However, this trend of preferring cheap imported rice over domestic rice continues to be a concern for those who wish to preserve the tradition of domestic rice farming and brewing. By 2014, the MMA system underwent a major shift with the introduction of tariffication. This policy change replaced the existing import quota system with high tariffs of around 513%, theoretically allowing for increased foreign rice imports whilst discouraging an overwhelming influx that could threaten domestic farmers. Although the new system facilitated greater availability of foreign rice, consumer preferences remained strongly in favor of domestically grown Japonica rice, which is considered superior in quality and taste.
The steady decline of non-rice crops.
While South Korea was able to sustain a considerable degree of protection for its rice industry, other staple crops such as barley, wheat, and soybeans faced a far less favorable outcome. With reduced government support and growing competition from cheaper foreign imports, domestic production of these crops declined significantly, leading to an increased reliance on imported alternatives. The liberalization of agricultural product market meant that grains produced in countries with large-scale agricultural industries, such as the United States and Australia, were available at much lower prices. This shift put South Korean farmers at a severe disadvantage, forcing many to abandon other staple crops altogether. Over time, the country's self-sufficiency in wheat, barley, and soybeans decreased, raising concerns about food security and the long-term viability of domestic grain production. The decline in the production of these crops reshaped South Korea's agricultural landscape, further reinforcing the dominance of rice while reducing the diversity of domestically grown staple foods.
Farmer resistance and long-lasting memories.
The liberalization of South Korea's rice market did not occur without fierce resistance. Farmers, particularly those in rural regions, viewed trade liberalization policies as a direct threat to their livelihoods and strongly opposed any attempts to open the market further to foreign competition. Their opposition was expressed through large-scale protests, political lobbying, and organized resistance movements aimed at pressuring the government to maintain protections for domestic agriculture. These efforts influenced the government's policy, leading to a series of compensation measures designed to support farmers amid the transition. Despite South Korea's commitments to global trade agreements, the government continued to implement subsidies, direct payments, and financial assistance programs to help rice farmers remain competitive. Protests persisted, however, with farmers arguing that even with subsidies, the long-term sustainability of their livelihoods was in jeopardy. The intense political backlash highlighted the deep tensions between trade liberalization and the need to preserve rural agricultural economies, forcing policymakers to adopt a more cautious approach to market reform. What further complicates this issue is the aforementioned historical experience. As evidenced by the stigma associated with Tongil rice from the Honam region, Korean farmers generally empathize with the narrative that while they have made personal sacrifices and cooperated for the national interest, the state ultimately betrayed their trust. Economists and administrators in metropole who deliberate agricultural policies through statistical figures often find such sentiments overly emotional and uncomfortable. However, history teaches us the lesson that policies ignoring human emotions are ultimately unlikely to succeed. Therefore, the future of South Korea's agricultural trade policies will likely involve careful negotiations to determine the extent of further market integration. While economic efficiency and trade competitiveness are important considerations, policymakers must also account for the need to sustain domestic agricultural production to ensure food security.